The Transformation. Franz Kafka. Part 1. When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning from restless dreams, he found himself transformed into a monstrous vermin in his bed. He lay on his armor-like hard back, and when he lifted his head a little, he saw his arched brown belly, divided by arched stiffeners, at the height of which the coverlet, ready to slide down completely, could hardly be maintained. His many legs, pitifully thin compared to his usual size, flickered helplessly before his eyes. What happened to me? He thought. It was not a dream. His room, a real human room, only a little too small, lay quietly between the four well-known walls. Above the table, on which was spread a disassembled sample collection of cloth goods, Samsa was a traveler, hung the picture he had recently cut out of an illustrated magazine and placed in a handsome gilded frame. It represented a lady wearing a fur hat and a fur boa, sitting upright and lifting a heavy fur in which her whole forearm had disappeared towards the viewer. Gregor's gaze then turned to the window, and the gloomy weather, raindrops could be heard hitting the window, made him quite melancholy. How would it be if I slept a little longer and forgot all foolishness, he thought, but that was quite impracticable, for he was accustomed to sleep on his right side, but in his present state he could not bring himself into that position. No matter how hard he threw himself on his right side, he rocked back to the supine position again and again. He tried it 100 times, closed his eyes so as not to have to see the wriggling legs, and only stopped when he began to feel a light, dull pain in his side that he had never felt before. Oh God, he thought, what a strenuous profession I have chosen. Day in, day out on the journey. The business excitement is much greater than in the actual business at home, and besides, I am still burdened with this plague of travel, the worries about the train connections, the irregular, bad food, an ever-changing, never-lasting, never-warm-hearted human intercourse. The devil take it all. He felt a slight itch on the top of his stomach, slowly pushed himself on his back closer to the bedpost in order to be able to lift his head better, found the itchy spot, which was covered with nothing but small white dots, which he did not know how to judge, and wanted to touch the spot with one leg, but immediately withdrew it, for at the touch he felt cold shivers. He slipped back into his former position. This early rising, he thought, makes one quite stupid. Man must have his sleep. Other travelers live like harem women. For example, when I go back to the inn in the course of the morning to sign over the orders I have obtained, these gentlemen are only sitting down at breakfast. I should try that with my boss. I would fly out on the spot. By the way, who knows if that wouldn't be very good for me? If I hadn't held back because of my parents, I would have quit long ago. I would have stepped up to the boss and told him my opinion from the bottom of my heart. He should have fallen from the desk. It is also a strange way to sit down on the desk and talk from above to the employee, who, moreover, has to come very close because of the boss's hearing loss. Well, the hope is not yet complete. Abandoned. Once I have the money together to pay off the parents' debt to him, it will probably take another 5 or 6 years. I will definitely do the thing. Then the big cut is made. For the time being, however, I must get up, for my train leaves at 5. And he looked over at the alarm clock that ticked on the box. Heavenly Father, he thought. It was 7:30 o'clock, and the hands went forward quietly. It was even half over. It was already approaching 3/4. Shouldn't the alarm clock have rang? You could see from the bed that he was correctly set for 4 o'clock. Certainly he had also rung the bell. Yes, but was it possible to sleep through this furniture-shaking ringing? Well, he hadn't slept peacefully, but probably all the more soundly. But what should he do now? The next train left at 7 o'clock. To catch up with him he would have had to hurry senselessly, and the collection was not yet packed, and he himself did not feel particularly fresh and agile. And even if he overtook the train, a thunderstorm from the boss was unavoidable, for the clerk had waited at the 5 o'clock train and had long since reported his failure. It was a creature of the boss, without spine or mind. What if he called in sick? But that would be extremely embarrassing and suspicious, because Gregor had not even been ill during his 5 years of service. Certainly the boss would come with a health insurance doctor, reproach the parents for the lazy son, and cut off all objections by referring to the health insurance doctor, for whom there are only very healthy but work-shy people. And would he be so completely wrong in this case? Gregor actually felt quite well, apart from a really superfluous drowsiness after the long sleep, and was even particularly hungry. As he thought all this over in great haste, without being able to make up his mind to leave his bed, the alarm clock was just striking 7:15. There was a careful knock at the door at the head of his bed. "Gregor," he cried. It was his mother. "It's 7:15. Didn't you want to go away?" The soft voice. Gregor was startled when he heard his answering voice, which was unmistakably his former voice, but in which, as if from below, there was mingled with an irrepressible, painful beeping, which literally left the words in their distinctness only for the first moment, in order to destroy them in the aftermath to such an extent that one did not know whether one had heard correctly. Gregor had wanted to answer in detail and explain everything, but in these circumstances he limited himself to saying, "Yes, yes, thank you, mother, I'll get up." As a result of the wooden door, the change in Gregor's voice was probably not noticeable outside, because the mother calmed herself down with this explanation and sipped away. But through the little conversation, the other members of the family had become aware that, contrary to expectations, Gregor was still at home, and already his father knocked on one side door, weakly but with his fist. "Gregor, Gregor," he cried, "what's the matter?" And after a little while he admonished again in a lower voice, "Gregor, Gregor." At the other side door, however, the sister complained softly, "Gregor, are you not well? Do you need anything?" On both sides Gregor answered, "I'm done," and endeavored to remove everything remarkable from his voice by the most careful pronunciation and by interspersing long pauses between the individual words. The father also returned to his breakfast, but the sister whispered, "Gregor, open the door, I implore you." Gregor, however, did not even think of opening the door, but praised the caution taken from traveling to lock all doors at home during the night. At first he wanted to get up quietly and undisturbed, get dressed, and above all have breakfast, and only then think about what would happen, because he noticed well, he would not come to a reasonable end with his thinking in bed. He remembered that he had often felt some slight pain in bed, perhaps caused by clumsy lying, which then turned out to be pure imagination when he got up, and he was curious to see how his current ideas would gradually dissolve. That the change in voice was nothing more than the harbinger of a severe cold, an occupational disease of the travelers, he did not doubt in the least. Throwing off the blanket was very easy. He only had to puff himself up a little, and she fell of her own accord. But it continued to be difficult, especially because it was so incredibly wide. He would have needed arms and hands to get up, but instead he had only the many little legs, which were constantly in the most varied movements, and which, moreover, he could not control. If he wanted to give in to one of them, the first thing he did was to stretch it, and when he finally succeeded in doing what he wanted with this leg, all the others were now working in the greatest and painful excitement, as if they had been set free. "Just don't stay in bed unnecessarily," Gregor said to himself. At first he wanted to get out of bed with the lower part of his body, but this lower part, which by the way he had not yet seen, and of which he could not form a proper idea, proved to be too difficult to move. It went so slowly, and when at last, almost wild, he pushed forward with collected strength without consideration, he had chosen the wrong direction, struck violently at the lower bedpost, and the burning pain he felt taught him that the lower part of his body was perhaps the most sensitive at the moment. He therefore tried to get his upper body out of bed first and carefully turned his head towards the edge of the bed. This was also easily achieved, and despite its width and heaviness, the body mass finally slowly followed the turn of the head. But when at last he held his head outside the bed in the open air, he was afraid to advance any further in this way, for if he finally let himself fall like this, a miracle would have to happen if the head was not to be injured. And he must not lose his senses at any price. He preferred to stay in bed. But when, after the same effort, he lay there sighing as before, and again saw his little legs fighting against each other, possibly even worse, and finding no way of bringing peace and order to this arbitrariness, he said to himself again that it was impossible for him to stay in bed, and that it was the most sensible thing to sacrifice everything, if there was even the slightest hope, to free themselves from the bed in this way. At the same time, however, he did not forget to remind himself that much better than desperate resolutions is calm and calmest reflection. At such moments he fixed his eyes as keenly as possible on the window, but unfortunately there was little confidence and cheerfulness to be gained from the sight of the morning mist, which veiled even the other side of the narrow street. Already 7 o'clock, he said to himself as he struck the alarm clock again. Already 7 o'clock and still such a fog. And for a while he lay quietly with weak breath, as if he perhaps expected from complete silence the return of real and self-evident conditions. But then he said to himself, before 7:45 strikes, I must have left my bed completely. Besides, someone will come out of the shop to ask for me by then, for the shop will open before 7 o'clock. And he now set about rocking his body out of bed completely evenly along its entire length. If he let himself fall out of bed in this way, the head, which he wanted to raise sharply when falling, would probably remain unharmed. The back seemed hard. Nothing would happen to him if he fell on the carpet. His greatest concern was the consideration of the loud noise that would be made, and which would probably excite if not terror at least anxiety behind all doors. But that had to be dared. When Gregor was already halfway out of bed, the new method was more of a game than an effort. He only had to swing jerkily. He remembered how easy everything would be if he were to be helped. 2 strong people, he thought of his father and the maid, would have been quite enough. They would only have had to push their arms under his arched back, peel him out of bed, bend down with the load, and then only carefully tolerate that he would make the overswing on the floor, where the little legs would hopefully get a meaning. Well, quite apart from the fact that the doors were locked, should he really have called for help? Despite all the hardship, he could not suppress a smile at the thought. He had already reached the point where he could hardly keep his balance with stronger rocking, and very soon he had to make a final decision, for it was 7:45 in 5 minutes when the doorbell rang. That's someone from the shop, he said to himself, almost froze, while his little legs danced all the more hurriedly. For a moment all remained silent. They don't open, Gregor said to himself, caught up in some senseless hope. But then, of course, as always, the maid walked firmly to the door and opened it. Gregor only had to hear the visitor's first greeting and already knew who it was, the chief clerk himself. Why was only Gregor condemned to serve in a company where the slightest omission immediately aroused the greatest suspicion? If all the employees were all scoundrels, was there not a loyal, devoted person among them who, if he had not taken advantage of even a few hours of the morning for business, became mad with remorse and was virtually unable to get out of bed? Was it really not enough to have an apprentice inquire? If this questioning was necessary at all, would the chief clerk himself have to come, and would it have to be shown to the whole innocent family that the investigation of this suspicious matter could only be entrusted to the mind of the chief clerk? And it was more in consequence of the agitation into which Gregor was thrown by these reflections than as a result of a correct decision that he swung himself out of bed with all his might. There was a loud bang, but it wasn't a real crash. The fall was somewhat softened by the carpet, and the back was also more elastic than Gregor had thought, hence the not-so-conspicuous dull sound. Only he had not held his head carefully enough and struck it. He turned it and rubbed it against the carpet in anger and pain. "Something has fallen in there," said the chief clerk in the next room on the left. Gregor tried to imagine whether something similar could not happen to the chief clerk as he does today. The possibility of this had to be admitted. But as if to give a rude answer to this question, the chief clerk in the next room now took a few definite steps and creaked his patent leather boots. From the next room on the right, the sister whispered to inform Gregor, "Gregor, the chief clerk is here." "I know," said Gregor to himself, but so loud that his sister could have heard it, he did not dare to raise his voice. "Gregor," said his father from the next room on the left, "the chief clerk has come and inquires why you didn't leave on the early train. We don't know what to say to him. By the way, he also wants to talk to you personally. So please open the door. He will have the goodness to excuse the disorder in the room." "Good morning, Mr. Samsa," the chief clerk called in a friendly manner. "He is not well," said the mother to the chief clerk while the father was still talking at the door. "He is not well, believe me, Mr. Chief Clerk. How else would Gregor miss a train? The boy has nothing on his mind but business. I'm almost annoyed that he never goes out in the evening. Now he had been in the city for 8 days, but every evening he was at home. There he sits at our table and quietly reads the newspaper or studies timetables. It is already a distraction for him when he occupies himself with fretwork. For example, he carved a small frame over the course of 2 or 3 evenings. You'll be amazed at how handsome he is. It hangs in the room. You'll see him in a moment until Gregor opens the door. By the way, I am happy that you are here, Mr. Authorized Signatory. We alone would not have made Gregor open the door. He is so obstinate, and he is certainly not well, though he denied it in the morning. I'll be right there, said Gregor slowly and deliberately, not moving so as not to lose a word of the conversation. I can't explain it any other way, madam, said the chief clerk. I hope it's nothing serious. If, on the other hand, I must say that we businessmen, as you will, unfortunately or fortunately, very often have to overcome a slight indisposition simply for business reasons. So the chief clerk can come in to see you? Asked the impatient father, knocking at the door again. No, said Gregor. In the next room on the left, there was an awkward silence. In the next room on the right, the sister began to sob. Why didn't the sister go to the others? She had probably only just gotten out of bed and hadn't even started to get dressed yet. And why did she cry? Because he didn't get up and didn't let the authorized signatory in, because he was in danger of losing his post, and because then the boss would persecute the parents again with the old demands? These were probably unnecessary worries for the time being. Gregor was still here and did not think in the least about leaving his family. Instantly he was lying there on the carpet, and no one who knew his condition would have seriously demanded that he let the chief clerk in. But because of this little rudeness, for which a suitable excuse would easily be found later, Gregor could not be sent away immediately. And it seemed to Gregor that it would be much more sensible to leave him alone now instead of disturbing him with weeping and persuasion. But it was precisely uncertainty that oppressed the others and excused their conduct. Mr. Samsa, cried the chief clerk in a raised voice. What's the matter? You barricade yourself in your room. Answer only yes and no, 'cause your parents' heavy, unnecessary worries, and, this is only mentioned in passing, neglect your business duties in an actually unheard of way. I am speaking here on behalf of your parents and your boss, and I ask you very seriously for an immediate, clear explanation. I'm amazed. I thought I knew you to be a quiet, sensible man, and now you seem to be suddenly beginning to parade with strange moods. The boss hinted to me this morning as a possible explanation for your omissions. It concerned the debt collection which has recently been entrusted to you, but I really almost gave my word of honor that this explanation could not be true. But now I see here your incomprehensible stubbornness and completely lose all desire to intercede for you in the slightest. And your position is by no means the most stable. I originally intended to tell you all this in private, but since you are letting me waste my time here uselessly, I don't know why you parents should not know about it. Her performances in recent times have therefore been very unsatisfactory. It is not the season to do special business, we acknowledge that. But there is no such thing as a season for not doing business, Mr. Samsa, there must not be. But Mr. Authorized Signatory, Gregor cried beside himself, forgetting everything else in the excitement, I'll open the door immediately. A slight malaise, a dizzy spell, prevented me from getting up. I'm still lying in bed now, but now I'm very fresh again. I've just gotten out of bed. Just a little moment's patience. Things are not going so well yet, as I thought. But I am already well. How can that overwhelm a human being like that? Yesterday evening I was still quite well, my parents know it, or rather, I already had a little premonition yesterday evening. You should have seen it. Why didn't I report it in the shop? But you always think that you will survive the illness without staying at home. Mr. Authorized Signatory. Spare my parents. There is no reason for all the reproaches you are making against me now. I was not told a word about it. You may not have read the last orders I sent. By the way, I still take the 8 o'clock train on the journey. The few hours of rest have strengthened me. Just don't linger, Mr. Authorized Signatory. I'll be in the business myself in a moment, and have the goodness to say that and recommend me to the boss. And while Gregor was hurriedly uttering all this, and hardly knew what he was saying, he had approached the box slightly, probably as a result of the practice he had already gained in bed, and was now trying to get up on it. He really wanted to open the door, actually show himself and talk to the chief clerk. He was anxious to know what the others, who now longed for him so much, would say at the sight of him. If they were frightened, then Gregor had no more responsibility and could be calm. But if they would accept everything calmly, then he would have no reason to be upset, and if he hurried he could actually be at the station at 8 o'clock. At first he slipped off the smooth box a few times, but at last he gave himself a last swing and stood upright. He no longer paid any attention to the pains in his abdomen, no matter how much they burned. Now he let himself fall against the back of a nearby chair, to the edges of which he held on with his little legs. But with that he had also gained control over himself and fell silent, because now he could listen to the chief clerk. "Have you understood a single word?" asked the chief clerk of the parents. "He doesn't make a fool of you, does he?" "For God's sake," cried the mother, already weeping, "he may be seriously ill, and we are tormenting him." "Greta! Greta!" she cried then. "Mother!" cried the sister from the other side. They communicated through Gregor's room. "You must go to the doctor at once. Gregor is ill. Quickly around the doctor. Have you heard Gregor speak now?" "That was an animal voice," said the chief clerk, remarkably low in the face of his mother's screams. "Anna! Anna!" cried the father through the anteroom into the kitchen, clapping his hands. "Fetch a locksmith at once." And already the two girls were running through the anteroom with rustling skirts. How had the sister dressed so quickly? And tore open the apartment door. The door was not heard slamming at all. They had probably left it open, as is customary in apartments where a great misfortune has occurred. But Gregor had become much calmer. His words were no longer understood, although they had seemed to him sufficiently clear, clearer than before, perhaps as a result of the habituation of the ear. But at least they now believed that he was not quite right, and were ready to help him. The confidence and certainty with which the first arrangements had been made did him good. He felt included in the human circle again and hoped for great and surprising achievements from both the doctor and the locksmith, without actually separating them exactly. In order to get as clear a voice as possible for the approaching decisive discussions, he coughed a little, but tried to do so in a very subdued way, since possibly this sound sounded different from human coughing, which he no longer dared to decide for himself. In the next room it had become quite quiet in the meantime. Perhaps the parents sat at the table with the chief clerk and whispered. Perhaps they all leaned against the door and listened. Gregor slowly pushed himself with the chair towards the door, let go of it there, threw himself against the door, held himself upright against it. The pads of his little legs had a little glue, and rested there for a moment from the effort. But then he set about turning the key in the lock with his mouth. It seemed, alas, that he had no real teeth. With what was he to grasp the key? But the jaws were certainly very strong. With their help he actually set the key in motion, and paid no attention to the fact that he undoubtedly did himself any harm, for a brown liquid came out of his mouth, flowed over the key, and dripped to the floor. "Listen," said the chief clerk in the next room, "he's turning the key." That was a great encouragement for Gregor, but everyone should have called out to him, even his father and mother. "Fresh, Gregor," they should have called, "always approach close to the castle." And in the idea that all his efforts were followed with suspense, he bit into the key with all the strength he could muster. According to the progress of the turn of the key, he danced round the castle. He now held himself upright only with his mouth, and as needed he hung on to the key or then pressed it down again with the whole weight of his body. The brighter sound of the lock snapping back at last literally woke Gregory. With a sigh of relief he said to himself, "So I didn't need the locksmith," and put his head on the handle to open the door completely. Since he had to open the door in this way, it was actually already quite wide open, and he himself was not yet to be seen. He had to turn slowly around one of the doors, and very carefully, if he didn't want to fall clumsily on his back just before entering the room. He was still busy with that difficult movement, and had no time to pay attention to anything else, when he heard the chief clerk utter a loud "oh." It sounded as if the wind were rushing, and now he saw him too, pressing his hand against his open mouth and slowly retreating, as if he were driven away by an invisible, evenly continuing force. The mother, she was standing here in spite of the presence of the chief clerk, with her hair still unraveling from the night, first looked at her father with folded hands, then took 2 steps to Gregor and fell down in the midst of her skirts, which spread out around her, her face lowered to her breast, quite untraceable. The father clenched his fist with a hostile expression, as if he wanted to push Gregor back into his room, then looked around the living room uncertainly, then shaded his eyes with his hands and wept so that his mighty chest shook. Gregor did not enter the room at all, but leaned against the bolted door from the inside, so that only half of his body could be seen, and above it the head tilted to the side, with which he peered over to the others. It had become much brighter in the meantime. Clearly on the other side of the street stood a section of the opposite, endless, gray-black house. It was a hospital, with its regular windows breaking hard through the front. The rain was still falling, but only with large drops, individually visible and literally thrown down to the earth one by one. The breakfast dishes were on the table in abundance. For the father breakfast was the most important meal of the day, which he spent for hours reading various newspapers. Just on the opposite wall hung a photograph of Gregor from his military days, which depicted him as a lieutenant, his hand on his sword, smiling carelessly, demanding respect for his posture and uniform. The door to the anteroom was open, and since the door of the apartment was also open, one could see out onto the forecourt of the apartment and the beginning of the downward staircase. "Well," said Gregor, well aware that he was the only one who had kept calm, "I'm going to get dressed right away, pack up the collection and drive away. Will you let me go?" "Well, Mr. Authorized Signatory, you see, I am not stubborn and I like to work. Traveling is arduous, but I couldn't live without traveling." "Where are you going, Mr. Authorized Signatory?" "Into business?" "Yes." "Will you report everything truthfully? One may be unable to work at the moment, but then it is just the right time to remember one's past achievements and to remember that later, after the removal of the obstacle, one will certainly work all the more diligently and collected. I am so indebted to the boss, you know that very well. On the other hand, I am worried about my parents and sister. I'm in a tight spot, but I'll work my way out of it. But don't make it more difficult for me than it already is. Keep in business, my party. You don't love the traveler, I know. You think he earns a lot of money and leads a nice life. There is no particular reason to think through this prejudice better. But you, Mr. Authorized Signatory, you have a better overview of the conditions than the rest of the staff, and even quite confidently, a better overview than the boss himself, who, in his capacity as an entrepreneur, is easily misled in his judgment to the detriment of an employee. They also know very well that the traveler who is out of business almost all year round can so easily become a victim of gossip, accidents, and groundless complaints, against which it is quite impossible for him to defend himself, since he usually learns nothing at all about them, and only when he has finished a journey exhausted, at home the bad consequences, the causes of which can no longer be understood. Mr. Chief Clerk, don't go away without saying a word to show me that you agree with me at least to a small extent." But the chief clerk had already turned away at Gregor's first words, and only over his shrugging shoulders did he look back at Gregor with pursed lips. And during Gregor's speech he did not stand still for a moment, but withdrew towards the door without taking his eyes off Gregor, but very gradually, as if there were a secret prohibition to leave the room. He was already in the anteroom, and after the sudden movement with which he pulled his foot out of the sitting room for the last time, one might have thought that he had just burned his soul. In the anteroom, however, he stretched out his right hand far away from him to the stairs, as if an almost unearthly deliverance were waiting for him there. Gregor realized that he must not let the chief clerk go away in this mood, if his position in the business was not to be endangered to the utmost. The parents did not understand all this so well. They had formed the conviction over the long years that Gregor was provided for in this business for his life, and besides, they were now so busy with the worries of the moment that they had lost all foresight. But Gregor had this foresight. The chief clerk had to be retained, reassured, convinced, and finally won. The future of Gregor and his family depended on it. If only the sister had been here. She was clever. She had already cried when Gregor was still lying quietly on his back. And certainly the chief clerk, this lady's friend, would have allowed himself to be guided by her. She would have closed the door of the apartment and talked him out of his fright in the anteroom. But his sister was not there. Gregor himself had to act. And without thinking that he did not yet know his present ability to move, Without also thinking that his speech might not have been understood again, he left the doorway, pushed through the opening, wanted to go to the chief clerk, who was already ridiculously holding on to the railing of the forecourt with both hands, but immediately, looking for a foothold, fell down on his many little legs with a little cry. Scarcely had this happened than he felt a bodily well-being for the first time that morning. The little legs had solid ground under them. They obeyed perfectly, as he noticed to his delight. They even strove to carry him away wherever he wanted, and already he believed that the final improvement of all suffering was imminent. But at the same moment as he was lying on the floor, rocking with restrained movement, not far from his mother, directly opposite her, the latter, who seemed so completely absorbed in herself, suddenly jumped up, her arms outstretched, her fingers spread, cried, "Help, for God's sake, help!" As if she wanted to see Gregor better, but in contradiction to this, ran back senselessly. Had forgotten that behind her stood the laid table. When she reached him, she sat down on him as if absent-mindedly, and she did not seem to notice that beside her the coffee was pouring out of the overturned large pot in full stream onto the carpet. "Mother, mother," Gregor said softly, and looked up at her. The chief clerk had completely disappeared from his mind for a moment. On the other hand, he could not resist snapping his jaws several times into the void at the sight of the flowing coffee. The mother cried out again, fled from the table, and fell into the arms of her father, who was rejoicing towards her. But Gregor had no time for his parents now. The chief clerk was already on the stairs. His chin on the railing, he looked back for the last time. Gregor made a run to catch up with him as safely as possible. The chief clerk must have suspected something, for he made a leap over several steps and disappeared. "Ha!" he shouted, and it rang through the whole stairwell. Unfortunately, this flight of the chief clerk now also seemed to completely confuse the father, who had hitherto been comparatively composed, for instead of running after the chief clerk himself, or at least not hindering Gregor in pursuit, he seized with his right hand the stick of the chief clerk, which he had left behind on a chair with his hat and overcoat, took a large newspaper from the table with his left hand and set about it, stamping his feet, to drive Gregor back to his room by, waving the stick and the newspaper. No plea from Gregor helped. No plea was understood. No matter how humbly he turned his head, his father only stamped his feet harder. On the other side, in spite of the cool weather, the mother had flung open a window, and leaning out she pressed her face into her hands far outside the window. A strong draught arose between the alley and the stairwell. The window curtains flew open. The newspapers rustled on the table. Individual sheets of paper blew across the floor. The father pressed relentlessly and let out sibilants like a savage. But now Gregor had no practice in walking backwards at all. It was really very slow. If only Gregor had been allowed to turn around, he would have been in his room right away. But he was afraid of making his father impatient with a time-consuming turn, and at any moment he was threatened with a fatal blow to the back or head from the stick in his father's hand. In the end, however, Gregor had no other choice. For he noticed with horror that he did not even know how to keep the direction when walking backwards. And so, with incessantly anxious sideways glances at his father, he began to turn around as quickly as possible, but in reality only very slowly. Perhaps the father noticed his goodwill, for he did not disturb him, but even directed the turning movement from a distance here and there with the tip of his stick. If only it hadn't been for this unbearable hissing of the father. Gregor lost his head completely over it. He was almost completely turned around when, always listening to this hissing, he was even mistaken and turned back a bit. But when he was finally happy with his head in front of the doorway, it turned out that his body was too broad to get through without further ado. Of course, in his present condition, the father did not even remotely think of opening the other door wing to create a sufficient passage for Gregor. His fixed idea was only that Gregor must get to his room as soon as possible. He would never have allowed the cumbersome preparations that Gregor needed to get up and perhaps get through the door in this way. On the contrary, as if there were no obstacle, he now urged Gregor forward with a particular noise. Even behind Gregor it no longer sounded like the voice of a single father. Now there was really no more fun, and Gregor pushed himself into the door, come what may. One side of his body lifted, he lay crooked in the doorway. One flank was all rubbed wounded. Ugly stains remained on the white door. Soon he was stuck and could not have moved on his own. The little legs on one side hung trembling in the air. Those on the other were painfully pressed to the ground. Then the father gave him a strong push from behind, which was now truly redeeming, and he flew, bleeding heavily, far into his room. The door was slammed shut with a stick. Then it was finally quiet. Part 2. It was not until dusk that Gregor woke up from his heavy, fainting-like sleep. He would certainly not have woken up much later without disturbance, for he felt sufficiently rested and well-rested. But it seemed to him that he had been awakened by a hasty step and a cautious closing of the door leading to the antechamber. The glow of the electric street lamps lay pale here and there on the ceiling and on the higher parts of the furniture, but it was dark down below Gregor. Slowly, still clumsily groping with his feelers, which he was only now learning to appreciate, he pushed himself towards the door to see what had happened there. His left side seemed to be one long, unpleasantly tense scar, and he had to limp on his 2 rows of legs. By the way, a little leg had been badly injured in the course of the previous morning's incidents. It was almost a miracle that only one had been injured, and dragged lifelessly along. It was only at the door that he realized what had actually lured him there. It had been the smell of something edible. For there was a bowl filled with sweet milk, in which small slices of white bread floated. He almost laughed with joy, for he was even more hungry than in the morning, and immediately he dipped his head almost up to his eyes in the milk. But he soon withdrew it disappointed. Not only did he find it difficult to eat because of his delicate left side, and he could only eat if his whole body worked with him panting, but he did not like the milk at all, which was usually his favorite drink, and which his sister had certainly put in for him for that reason. Nay, he turned away from the bowl almost with reluctance and crept back into the middle of the room. In the living room, as Gregor looked through the crack in the door, the gas was lit, but while at this time of day the father used to present his afternoon newspaper to his mother and sometimes to his sister with a raised voice, no sound was heard now. Well, perhaps this reading aloud, of which his sister always told and wrote to him, had recently become out of practice altogether. But it was so quiet all around, too, although the apartment was certainly not empty. What a quiet life the family led, Gregor said to himself, and as he stared fixedly into the darkness in front of him, he felt great pride that he had been able to provide his parents and sister with such a life in such a beautiful apartment. But what if now all peace, all prosperity, all contentment should come to an end with horror? In order not to lose himself in such thoughts, Gregor preferred to move and crawl up and down the room. Once during the long evening one side door and once the other was opened to a small crack and quickly closed again. Someone probably felt the need to come in, but again too many concerns. Gregor now stopped directly at the living room door, determined to bring the hesitant visitor in somehow, or at least to find out who it was. But now the door was no longer opened and Gregor waited in vain. Early on, when the doors were locked, everyone had wanted to come into him. Now that he had opened one door and the others had apparently been opened during the day, no one came anymore, and the keys were now also from the outside. It was late at night that the light in the sitting room was extinguished, and now it was easy to see that the parents and sister had stayed awake so long, for, as could be clearly heard, all 3 were now walking away on tiptoe. Now no one came into Gregor until morning, so he had a long time to think undisturbed about how he should now rearrange his life. But the high open room in which he was forced to lie flat on the floor frightened him, without his being able to find out the cause, for it was his room, which he had occupied for 5 years, and with a half-unconscious turn, and not without a slight shame, he hurried under the couch, where, although his back was pressed a little, and although he could no longer raise his head, he immediately felt very comfortable, and only regretted that his body was too broad to be completely accommodated. Under the couch. There he remained the whole night, which he spent partly in a half-sleep, from which hunger always startled him, and partly in sorrows and vague hopes, all of which, however, led to the conclusion that he must keep quiet for the time being, and by patience and the greatest consideration make the inconvenience of the family bearable, which he was forced to cause them in his present condition. Early in the morning, it was almost night. Gregor had the opportunity to test the strength of the decisions he had just made, for from the anteroom the sister, almost fully dressed, opened the door and looked in with excitement. She did not find him at once, but when she saw him under the couch, God, he must be somewhere, he could not have flown away. She was so frightened that, without being able to control herself, she slammed the door again from the outside. But as if she regretted her behavior, She immediately opened the door again and stepped in on tiptoe as if she were with a seriously ill person or even with a stranger. Gregor had pushed his head forward to the edge of the couch and was watching her. Would she notice that he had left the milk, and that by no means for want of hunger, and would she bring in some other food that suited him better? If she didn't do it of her own accord, he would rather starve than draw her attention to it, although he was really tremendously anxious to rush forward under the couch, throw himself at his sister's feet and ask her for something good to eat. But the sister immediately noticed with astonishment the still full bowl, from which only a little milk had been spilled all around. She picked it up at once, not with her bare hands, but with a rag, and carried it out. Gregor was extremely curious about what she would bring as a replacement, and he had all kinds of thoughts about it. But he could never have guessed what the sister was really doing in her kindness. To test his taste, she brought him a whole selection, all spread out on an old newspaper. There were old half-rotten vegetables, bones from the supper surrounded by hardened white sauce, a few raisins and almonds, a cheese that Gregor had declared inedible 2 days ago, a dry bread, a bread smeared with butter and salted. In addition to all this, she put the bowl, probably intended for Gregor once and for all, into which she had poured water. And out of delicacy, knowing that Gregor would not eat in front of her, she hurried away and even turned the key, so that only Gregor could notice that he could make it as comfortable as he wanted. Gregor's little legs were buzzing when it came to dinner. His wounds, by the way, must have been completely healed. He no longer felt any obstruction. He was amazed at it and thought of how more than a month ago he had cut his finger very little with a knife, and how this wound had hurt him enough the day before yesterday. Should I be less sensitive now? He thought, sucking greedily at the cheese to which he had been immediately and emphatically drawn above all other dishes. In quick succession, and with eyes watering with satisfaction, he ate the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh food, on the other hand, did not taste good to him. He could not even bear their smell, and even dragged the things he wanted to eat a little further away. He had long since finished everything, and was now lying lazily in the same place, when his sister slowly turned the key as a sign for him to withdraw. This startled him at once, although he was almost asleep, and he hurried back under the couch. But it cost him a great deal of self-control to stay under the couch even for the short time that his sister was in the room, for his body had rounded a little from the abundant food, and he could hardly breathe there in the narrowness. With small fits of suffocation, he watched with slightly bulging eyes as the unsuspecting sister swept up with a broom not only the leftovers, but even the food that Gregor had not touched at all, as if these were no longer usable, and how she hastily poured everything into a bucket, which she closed with a wooden lid, whereupon she carried everything out. As soon as she had turned around, Gregor pulled himself out from under the couch and stretched and puffed himself up. In this way Gregor got his food every day, once in the morning, when the parents and the maid were still asleep, the second time after the general lunch, because then the parents also slept for a while, and the maid was sent away by his sister with some errand. Of course, they didn't want Gregor to starve to death either, but perhaps they couldn't bear to learn more about his food than by hearsay. Maybe their sister wanted to spare them a little grief, because in fact they were suffering just enough. Gregor could not find out what excuses had been used to get the doctor and the locksmith out of the apartment that first morning, because since he was not understood, no one, not even his sister, thought that he could understand the others, and so when his sister was in his room, he had to be content with only to hear here and there their sighs and calls of the saints. It was only later, when she had gotten used to everything a little, of course, there could never be any question of complete habituation, that Gregor sometimes caught a remark that was meant in a friendly way or could be interpreted as such. But he liked it today, she said, when Gregor had tidied up the food, while in the opposite case, which gradually repeated itself more and more often, she used to say, almost sadly, "Now everything has stopped again." But while Gregor could not learn any news immediately, he heard many things from the adjoining rooms, and wherever he heard voices only once, he ran straight to the door in question and pressed himself against it with all his body. Especially in the early days, there was no conversation that did not deal with him in some way, even if only in secret. For 2 days there were consultations at all meals about how to behave now, but also between meals they talked about the same topic, because there were always at least 2 family members at home, since no one wanted to stay at home alone and there was no way to leave the apartment completely. On the very first day, it was not quite clear what or how much she knew of what had happened, The maid had begged her mother on her knees to dismiss her at once, and when she took leave a quarter of an hour later, she thanked her with tears for her dismissal, as for the greatest favor that had been done to her here, and without her being asked to take a terrible oath not to reveal the slightest thing to anyone. Now the sister, in association with her mother, also had to cook, but that didn't take much trouble, because you ate almost nothing. Again and again Gregor heard how one asked the other to eat in vain and got no other answer than, "Thank you, I've had enough," or something similar. Maybe nothing was drunk either. Often the sister asked her father if he wanted beer, and she offered to fetch it herself, and when the father was silent, she said, in order to dispel any misgivings, that she might as well send the caretaker for it. But then at last the father said a great no, and no more was said of it. Already in the course of the first day, the father explained the whole financial situation and prospects of both the mother and the sister. Now and then he got up from the table and fetched from his little Wertheim box, which he had saved from the collapse of his business 5 years before, some receipt or some notebook. He was heard unlocking the complicated lock and locking it again after removing what he was looking for. These explanations of his father were in part the first pleasant thing that Gregor had heard since his imprisonment. He had been of the opinion that his father had not the slightest thing left over from that business. At least his father had not told him anything to the contrary, and Gregor hadn't asked him about it either. Gregor's only concern at that time had been to do everything possible to make the family forget the business misfortune that had brought everyone into complete hopelessness as quickly as possible. And so he had begun to work with a very special zeal, and almost overnight he had gone from a small clerk to a traveler, who of course had quite different ways of earning money, and whose work successes were immediately transformed into cash in the form of commission, which could be placed on the table of the astonished and happy family at home. They had been good times, and never afterwards had they been repeated, at least in this splendor, although Gregor later earned so much money that he was able to bear the expenses of the whole family. They had just gotten used to it, both the family and Gregor. They gratefully accepted the money, he was happy to deliver it, but there was no longer any special warmth. Only his sister had remained close to Gregor, and it was his secret plan to send her, who, unlike Gregor, loved music very much and knew how to play the violin touchingly, to the conservatory next year, regardless of the great expense that this would cause, and which would be brought in some other way. Often during Gregor's short stays in the city, the conservatory was mentioned in conversations with his sister, but always only as a beautiful dream that could not be thought of being realized, and the parents did not even like to hear these innocent mentions, but Gregor thought of it very definitely, and intended to declare it solemnly on Christmas Eve. Such thoughts, quite useless in his present state, passed through his head as he glued upright to the door and listened. Sometimes he couldn't listen anymore because of general tiredness and let his head bang carelessly against the door, but immediately held it tight again, because even the little noise he had made with it had been heard next door and had silenced everyone. "What is he doing again?" said the father after a while, evidently turning towards the door, and only then was the interrupted conversation gradually resumed. Gregor now learned enough, for his father used to repeat himself often in his explanations, partly because he himself had not occupied himself with these things for a long time, partly also because his mother did not understand everything the first time, that in spite of all the misfortune there was still a very small fortune from the old days, which the untouched interest rates had allowed to rise a little in the meantime. Besides, however, the money that Gregor had brought home every month, he himself had kept only a few guilders for himself, had not been completely used up and had accumulated into a small capital. Gregor, behind his door, nodded eagerly, pleased with this unexpected caution and thrift. Actually, he could have used the surplus money to pay off his father's debt to the boss, and the day on which he could have gotten rid of this post would have been much closer, but now it was undoubtedly better the way his father had arranged it. But this money was not at all sufficient to let the family live on the interest. It was perhaps enough to sustain the family for 1, at most 2 years, but it was nothing more. It was therefore merely a sum which was not really allowed to be touched, and which had to be set aside for emergencies, but the money to live on had to be earned. Now, however, the father was a healthy but old man, who had not worked for 5 years, and at any rate could not trust himself to do much. He had put on a lot of fat during these 5 years, which were the first holidays of his laborious and yet unsuccessful life, and had become quite cumbersome as a result. And the old mother, who suffered from asthma, which was already exhausting to wander through the apartment, and who spent every other day in breathing difficulties on the sofa by the open window, was now to earn money? And the sister was to earn money, who was still a child at 17, and who was so much to be indulged in her previous way of life, which had consisted of dressing nicely, sleeping late, helping in the house, taking part in a few modest amusements, and above all playing the violin? When the conversation turned to this necessity of earning money, Gregor always let go of the door and threw himself on the cool leather sofa next to the door, for he was quite hot with shame and grief. He often lay there all the long nights, never slept for a moment, and only scratched the leather for hours. Or he did not shy away from the great trouble of pushing a chair to the window, then crawling up the window sill and leaning against the window, leaning into the chair, apparently only in some memory of the liberating thing that had once been in it for him to look out of the window. For in fact, from day to day he saw things that were even a little more distant. He never saw the hospital opposite, the sight of which he had previously cursed all too often, and if he had not known that he lived in the quiet but completely urban Charlottenstrasse, he might have thought he was looking from his window into a wasteland in which the gray sky and the gray earth were indistinguishably united. Only twice had the attentive sister had to see that the chair was by the window, when every time, after she had tidied up the room, she pushed the chair back exactly towards the window, and even left the inner casement open from now on. If Gregor could only have spoken to his sister and thanked her for everything she had to do for him, he would have endured her services more easily, but as it was, he suffered from it. Of course, his sister tried to blur the embarrassment of the whole thing as much as possible, and the longer the time passed, the better she succeeded, of course, but Gregor also saw through everything much more closely over time. Even her entrance was terrible for him. As soon as she had entered, she ran straight to the window without taking time to close the door, as much as she usually took care to spare everyone the sight of Gregor's room, and tore it open with hasty hands as if she were almost suffocating. Even if it was cold, she stayed by the window for a while and breathed deeply. With this running and clamoring, she frightened Gregor twice a day. All the time he trembled under the couch and knew very well that she would certainly have spared him if only it had been possible for her to stay in a room where Gregor was with the window closed. Once, a month had passed since Gregor's transformation, and it was no longer a special reason for the sister to be amazed at Gregor's appearance. She came a little earlier than usual and found Gregor looking out of the window, motionless and quite frightened. It would not have been unexpected for Gregor if she had not entered, since his position prevented her from opening the window immediately, but not only did she not enter, she even drove back and closed the door. A stranger might have thought that Gregor had been lying in wait for her and had wanted to bite her. Of course, Gregor immediately hid under the couch, but he had to wait until noon before his sister returned, and she seemed much more restless than usual. He saw from this that the sight of him was still unbearable to her, and must continue to be unbearable to her, and that she must have made a great effort not to run away from the sight of even the small part of his body with which he protruded from under the couch. One day, in order to spare her this sight, he carried the sheet on his back. It took him 4 hours to do this work, and arranged it in such a way that it was now completely covered, and the sister, even if she stooped, could not see him. If this sheet hadn't been necessary in her opinion, then she could have removed it, because it wasn't clear enough that it couldn't be Gregor's pleasure to shut himself off so completely, but she left the sheet as it was, and Gregor even thought he had caught a grateful look when he carefully lifted the sheet a little with his head, to see how the sister received the new facility. For the first fortnight, the parents could not bring themselves to come into him, and he often heard them fully recognize his sister's present work, whereas hitherto they had often been annoyed with his sister because she had seemed to them a somewhat useless girl. Now, however, both father and mother often waited in front of Gregor's room while his sister cleaned up there, and as soon as she came out she had to tell exactly what it looked like in the room, what Gregor had eaten, how he had behaved this time, and whether there was perhaps a slight improvement to be noticed. His mother, by the way, wanted to visit Gregor relatively soon, but his father and sister at first detained her with rational reasons, which Gregor listened to very attentively, and which he fully approved. Later, however, she had to be restrained by force, and when she cried, "Let me go to Gregor, he is my unhappy son. Don't you understand that I have to go to him?" Then Gregor thought that perhaps it would be good if his mother came in, not every day, of course, but perhaps once a week. She understood everything much better than her sister, who, in spite of all her courage, was only a child, and in the last analysis perhaps, had only taken on such a difficult task out of childish carelessness. Gregor's wish to see his mother was soon fulfilled. During the day Gregor did not want to show himself at the window out of consideration for his parents, but he could not crawl much on the few square meters of the floor. He could hardly bear to lie down quietly during the night. The food soon no longer gave him the slightest pleasure, and so he took the habit of crisscross over walls and ceilings. He especially liked to hang on top of the ceiling. It was quite different from lying on the floor. One breathed more freely. A slight swing went through the body, and in the almost happy absent-mindedness in which Gregor found himself up there, it could happen that, to his own surprise, he let go and slapped on the floor. But now, of course, he had quite different control over his body than before, and did not injure himself even in such a large fall. The sister now immediately noticed the new conversation that Gregor had found for himself. He also left traces of his glue here and there when he crawled, and then she took it into her head to make it possible for Gregor to crawl to the greatest extent and the furniture that prevented it, especially the chest and the desk. But now she was not able to do this alone. She did not dare to ask her father for help. The maid had certainly not helped her, for this girl, who was about 16 years old, had held out bravely since the dismissal of the former cook, but had asked for the privilege of being allowed to keep the kitchen locked incessantly and only to open it on special call. So there was nothing left for the sister to do but to fetch her mother once in her father's absence. With exclamations of excited joy, the mother also approached, but fell silent at the door in front of Gregor's room. First, of course, the sister looked to see if everything in the room was in order. Only then did she let her mother enter. Gregor had pulled the sheet even deeper and more into folds in great haste. The whole thing really looked like a sheet thrown over the couch by chance. Gregor also refrained from spying under the sheet this time. He refrained from seeing his mother this time, and was only glad that she had come after all. "Come, you can't see him," said the sister, and evidently led her mother by the hand. Gregor now heard how the two weak women moved the old box, which was still heavy, from its place, and how his sister kept taking up most of the work for herself, without listening to the warnings of her mother, who feared that she would overexert herself. It took a very long time. After a quarter of an hour's work, the mother said that it would be better to leave the chest here, because firstly, it was too heavy, they would not be able to finish it before his father arrived, and with the chest in the middle of the room they would block Gregor's every way, and secondly, it was not at all certain that Gregor would be doing Gregor a favor by removing the furniture. She seems to have the opposite case. The sight of the empty wall almost oppressed her heart, and why shouldn't Gregor have this feeling too, since he had long been accustomed to the furniture of the room and would therefore feel abandoned in the empty room. "And isn't it so?" the mother concluded very quietly, as she almost whispered, as if she wanted to prevent Gregor, whose exact whereabouts she did not know, from hearing even the sound of the voice, for she was convinced that he did not understand the words. "And is it not as if we were showing by the removal of the furniture that we give up all hope of improvement and leave him ruthlessly to himself? I think it would be best if we try to keep the room exactly in the same condition as it used to be, so that when Gregor comes back to us, he will find everything unchanged and can forget the meantime all the more easily." Listening to his mother's words, Gregor realized that the lack of any direct human address, combined with the monotony of life in the midst of the family, had bound to confuse his mind in the course of these 2 months, for there was no other explanation for the fact that he could seriously demand that his room be emptied. Did he really want to have the warm room, comfortably furnished with inherited furniture, transformed into a cave in which he would then be able to crawl undisturbed in all directions, but at the same time quickly and completely forgetting his human past? He was already on the verge of forgetting, and only his mother's voice, which had not been heard for a long time, had roused him. Nothing should be removed. Everything had to remain. He could not do without the good effects of the furniture on his condition, and if the furniture prevented him from doing the senseless crawling about, it was no harm, but a great advantage. But unfortunately the sister was of a different opinion. She had become accustomed, though not entirely unjustifiably, to appear as a special expert vis-a-vis her parents when discussing Gregor's affairs, and so now her mother's advice was reason enough for her sister, not only to remove not only the chest and the desk, which she had first thought of alone, but also to remove all the furniture, with the exception of the indispensable couch. Of course, it was not only childish defiance and the self-confidence that had been so unexpected and hard-won lately that determined her to make this demand. She had actually observed that Gregor needed a lot of room to crawl, but that he did not use the furniture in the slightest, as far as one could see. But perhaps the rapturous sense of the girls of her age also played a role, which seeks its satisfaction at every opportunity, and by which Greta now allowed herself to be tempted to want to make Gregor's situation even more terrifying, in order to be able to do even more for him than she has done so far. For in a room in which Gregor ruled the empty walls all by himself, no one but Greta would ever dare to enter. And so she did not allow herself to be dissuaded from her decision by her mother, who also seemed uncertain in this room because of sheer restlessness, soon fell silent and helped her sister as best she could to get the box out. Well, Gregor could still do without the chest in an emergency, but even the desk had to remain. And no sooner had the women left the room with the box against which they pressed themselves groaning, than Gregor poked his head out from under the couch to see how he could intervene cautiously and as considerately as possible. But unfortunately it was the mother who returned first, while Greta held the chest in the next room and swung it to and fro alone, without moving it from the spot, of course. The mother, however, was not used to the sight of Gregor. He could have made her sick, and so Gregor, frightened, hurried backwards to the other end of the couch, but could no longer prevent the sheet in front from moving a little. That was enough to draw the mother's attention. She stopped, stood still for a moment, and then went back to Greta. Although Gregor kept telling himself that nothing unusual was happening, but only a few pieces of furniture were being rearranged, he soon had to admit to himself that this walking back and forth of the women, their little shouts, the scratching of the furniture on the floor, had the effect on him like a great hustle and bustle nourished from all sides. And he had to, as tightly as he drew his head and legs to himself and pressed his body to the ground, he would inevitably say that he would not be able to stand the whole thing long. They cleared out his room, took from him everything that was dear to him. They had already carried out the box in which the fretsaw and other tools lay, loosened the desk, which had already been firmly buried in the ground, at which he had written his assignments as a commercial academic, as a citizen student, even as an elementary school student. Then he really had no more time to examine the good intentions of the two women, whose existence he had almost forgotten, by the way, for they were already working silently from exhaustion, and one could only hear the heavy tapping of her feet. And so he burst out. The women were leaning on the desk in the next room to catch their breath a little, and change the direction of the race 4 times. He really did not know what to say first, when he saw the picture of the lady dressed in all furs hanging strikingly on the wall, which was already empty, crept up in haste and pressed himself to the glass, which held him fast and did his hot belly good. At least this picture, which Gregor now completely obscured, would certainly not be taken away now. He turned his head towards the door of the sitting room to watch the women return. They had not allowed themselves much rest, and were already coming back. Greta had put her arm around her mother and was almost carrying her. "So what do we take now?" said Greta, and looked around. Then their eyes crossed with those of Gregor on the wall. It was probably only in consequence of her mother's presence that she kept her composure, bent her face to her mother to prevent her from looking around, and said, trembling and thoughtlessly, "Come, wouldn't we rather go back to the living room for a moment?" Greta's intention was clear to Gregor. She wanted to bring his mother to safety and then chase him down from the wall. Well, at least she could try. He sat on his picture and did not give it away. He would rather jump in Greta's face. But Greta's words had troubled her mother all the more. She stepped aside, saw the huge brown spot on the flowered wallpaper, cried out in a screaming, hoarse voice, before she actually realized that this was Gregor, what she saw, "Oh God," and fell over the couch with outstretched arms, as if she were giving up everything, and did not move. "You, Gregor!" cried the sister, with a raised fist and an intently look. These were the first words she had addressed directly to him since the transformation. She ran into the next room to fetch some essence with which she could awaken her mother from her fainting. Gregor also wanted to help. There was still time to save the picture, but he stuck firmly to the glass and had to tear himself free by force. He then ran into the next room, as if he could give his sister some advice, as in former times, but then he had to stand idly behind her, while she rummaged in various bottles. She was still frightened when she turned around. A bottle fell to the floor and broke. A splinter wounded Gregor's face. Some corrosive medicine surrounded him. Greta, without delaying any longer, took as many bottles as she could hold, and ran with them into her mother's house. She slammed the door shut with her foot. Gregor was now cut off from his mother, who was perhaps close to death through his fault. He was not allowed to open the door if he did not want to chase away his sister, who had to stay with her mother. He had nothing to do now but to wait, and beset by self-reproach and anxiety, he began to crawled over everything, walls, furniture, and ceiling, and at last, in his despair, when the whole room began to revolve around him, fell in the middle of the great table. A little while passed. Gregor lay there weakly. It was quiet all around. Perhaps that was a good sign. Then the bell rang. The girl was, of course, locked up in her kitchen, and Greta had to go open the door. The father had come. "What has happened?" were his first words. Greta's appearance had probably told him everything. Greta answered in a low voice, evidently pressing her face to her father's breast. "Mother was unconscious, but she is already better. Gregor has escaped." "I expected it," said the father. "I have always told you, but you women do not want to hear." It was clear to Gregor that his father had misinterpreted Greta's too brief message and assumed that Gregor had been guilty of some act of violence. So Gregor had to try to appease his father now, because he had neither time nor opportunity to enlighten him. And so he fled to the door of his room and pressed himself against it, so that his father could see as soon as he entered from the anteroom that Gregor had the best intention of returning to his room at once, and that it was not necessary to drive him back, but that one had only to open the door and he would disappear in a moment. But the father was not in the mood to notice such subtleties. "Ah!" he cried as soon as he entered, in a tone as if he were at once angry and glad. Gregor pulled his head back from the door and raised it against his father. He really had not imagined his father to be like he was now. However, he had lately neglected to take care of the goings-on in the rest of the apartment as before, and should have been prepared to meet with changed circumstances. Nevertheless, in spite of this, was that still the father? The same man who lay buried tired in bed when Gregor used to go out on a business trip, who had received him in an armchair on the evenings of his return in his dressing gown, was not quite able to get up, but had only raised his arms as a sign of joy, and who, during the rare walks together on a few Sundays a year and on the most important holidays between Gregor and his mother, which in and of themselves walked slowly, always a little more slowly, wrapped up in his old coat, worked his way forward with a crutch that was always carefully placed on it, and when he wanted to say something, almost always stopped and gathered his companions around him. But now he was quite well erect, dressed in a tight blue uniform with gold buttons, such as those worn by servants of the banking institutions. Over the high stiff collar of the coat developed his strong double chin. Under the bushy eyebrows the gaze of the black eyes penetrated fresh and attentive. The otherwise disheveled white hair was combed down into an embarrassingly precise, bright parting haircut. He threw his cap, on which was affixed a gold monogram, probably that of a bank, across the room in an arc towards the couch, and with the ends of his long uniform coat thrown back, his hands in his trouser pockets, walked towards Gregor with a grim face. He probably did not know himself what he was going to do. After all, he lifted his feet unusually high, and Gregor was amazed at the huge size of the soles of his boots. But he did not stop there, for he knew from the first day of his new life that his father considered only the greatest severity to be appropriate towards him. And so he ran before his father, stopped when his father stopped, and hurried forward again when his father only moved. So they made several rounds of the room without anything decisive happening, nay, without the whole thing having the appearance of a pursuit because of its slow pace. For this reason, Gregor also remained on the floor for the time being, especially since he feared that his father might consider a flight to the walls or the ceiling to be particularly wicked. However, Gregor had to tell himself that he would not be able to stand even this running for long, because while his father took a step, he had to make a myriad of movements. Shortness of breath was already beginning to make itself felt, just as he had not possessed a completely trustworthy lung in his earlier days. As he staggered along to gather all his strength for the race, he scarcely kept his eyes open. In his dullness he did not think of any other salvation than by running, and had almost forgotten that the walls were open to him, which were here certainly blocked by carefully carved furniture full of spikes and spikes, when just next to him, slightly hurled, something flew down and rolled in front of him. It was an apple. Immediately a second flew after him. Gregor stopped in terror. It was useless to run on, for his father had decided to bomb him. He had filled his pockets from the fruit bowl on the sideboard, and now, without aiming sharply for the time being, he threw apple after apple. These little red apples rolled around on the ground as if electrified and bumped into each other. A weakly thrown apple grazed Gregor's back, but slid off harmlessly. On the other hand, one who immediately flew after him literally penetrated Gregor's back. Gregor wanted to drag himself on, as if the surprising incredible pain could pass with the change of location, but he felt as if he had been nailed down, and stretched himself in complete confusion of all his senses. Only with his last glance did he see how the door of his room was flung open, and his mother hurried out of front of the screaming sister in her shirt, for the sister had undressed her in order to give her breathlessness in her fainting. How then the mother ran up to her father, and on the way her untied skirts slipped to the floor one after the other, and how, stumbling over the skirts, she pressed upon her father and, embracing him, in complete union with him, but now Gregor's eyesight was already failing, begged her hands on the back of his father's head to spare Gregor's life. Part 3. Gregor's severe wound, from which he suffered for more than a month, the apple, as no one dared to remove it, remained sitting in the flesh as a visible souvenir, seemed to have reminded even his father that Gregory, in spite of his present sad and disgusting figure, was a member of the family who was not to be treated as an enemy, but to whom it was the commandment of family duty to swallow the aversion and to tolerate nothing but to tolerate. And even though Gregor had probably lost his mobility forever due to his wound, and for the time being needed long minutes to cross his room like an old invalid, there was no question of crawling up high. He received what he thought was a completely sufficient substitute for this aggravation of his condition by the fact that the living room door, which he was accustomed to observe keenly an hour or two before, so that, lying in the darkness of his room, invisible from the living room, he could see the whole family at the lighted table and listen to their speeches, as it were with general permission, that is, quite differently from before. Of course, it was no longer the lively conversations of earlier times that Gregor had always thought of with some longing in the small hotel rooms when he had had to throw himself tired into the damp bedding. It was mostly very quiet now. The father fell asleep in his chair soon after supper. The mother and sister exhorted each other to silence. His mother, bent far under the light, sewed fine linen for a fashion shop. The sister, who had accepted a position as a saleswoman, learned shorthand and French in the evenings, in order to perhaps achieve a better position later on. Sometimes the father woke up, and as if he did not know that he had been asleep, he said to his mother, "How long you have been sewing again today?" and immediately fell asleep again, while mother and sister smiled wearily at each other. With a kind of obstinacy, the father refused to take off his servant's uniform even at home, and while the dressing gown hung uselessly on the coat hook, the father slumbered in his seat, fully dressed, as if he were always ready for his service and was waiting for the voice of his superior. As a result, the uniform, which was not new at first, lost its cleanliness in spite of all the care taken by his mother and sister, and Gregor often spent whole evenings looking at this dress, stained all over and shining with its gold buttons, in which the old man slept most uncomfortably and yet peacefully. As soon as the clock struck 10, the mother tried to wake the father by talking softly and then persuade him to go to bed, for it was not real sleep here, and the father, who had to start his work at 6 o'clock, needed it very much. But in the obstinacy that had seized him since he had been a servant, he always insisted on staying longer at table, in spite of the fact that he regularly fell asleep, and then, moreover, it was with the greatest difficulty that he could be persuaded to exchange the chair for the bed. No matter how much his mother and sister pressed him with little admonitions, for a quarter of an hour he shook his head slowly, held his eyes closed, and did not get up. The mother tugged at his sleeve, said words of flattery in his ear. The sister left her task to help the mother. But it didn't catch on with his father. He only sank deeper into his chair. It was only until the women took him under the armpits that he opened his eyes, looked alternately at his mother and sister, and used to say, "This is a life. That is the rest of my old age." And leaning on the two women, he got up awkwardly, as if he were the greatest burden to himself, let the women lead him to the door, waved them off there, and then went on independently, while his mother threw down her sewing kit, and his sister her quill, in order to run behind his father and continue to help him. Who in this exhausted and overtired family had time to take care of Gregor more than was absolutely necessary? The household was increasingly restricted, The maid was now dismissed after all. A huge bony waitress with white hair fluttering around her head came morning and evening to do the heaviest work. Everything else was taken care of by her mother in addition to her many sewing work. It even happened that various family jewels, which his mother and sister had previously worn overjoyed at entertainments and celebrations, were sold, as Gregor learned in the evening from the general discussion of the prices obtained. The greatest complaint, however, was always that one could not leave this apartment, which was too large for the present conditions, since it was impossible to imagine how to move Gregor. But Gregor saw well that it was not only consideration for him that prevented him from moving, for he could easily have been transported in a suitable box with a few air holes. What kept the family from moving was rather the complete hopelessness and the thought that they had been struck with a misfortune like no one else in the whole circle of relatives and acquaintances. What the world demands of poor people, they fulfilled to the utmost. The father fetched breakfast for the little bank clerks. The mother sacrificed herself for the washing of strangers. The sister ran to and fro behind the desk according to the orders of the customers, but the strength of the family did not extend any further. And the wound in his back began to hurt Gregor as if new when mother and sister, after they had put their father to bed, now returned, left the work behind, moved close together, were already sitting cheek to cheek, when his mother, pointing to Gregor's room, said, "Close the door there, Greta." And when Gregor was in the dark again, while the women next door mingled their tears or even stared at the table without tears, Gregor spent the nights and days almost entirely without sleep. Sometimes he thought of taking the affairs of the family into his own hands the next time he opened the door, just as he had done before. In his thoughts appeared again after a long time the boss and the chief clerk, the clerks and the apprentices, the so obtrusive house servant, 2 or 3 friends from other shops, a chambermaid from a hotel in the provinces, a dear, fleeting memory, a cashier from a hat shop for whom he had applied earnestly but too slowly. They all appeared mingled with strangers or already forgotten people. But instead of helping him and his family, they were all inaccessible, and he was glad when they disappeared. But then again, he was not in the mood to worry about his family. Only anger at the poor maintenance filled him, and although he could not imagine anything he would have had an appetite for, he made plans for how he could get into the pantry to take what he wanted, even if he was not hungry. After all, without thinking any more about how to do Gregor a special favor, the sister, before she ran to the shop in the morning and at noon, hurriedly pushed any food into Gregor's room with her foot, and in the evening swept it out with a wave of the broom, regardless of whether the food was perhaps only tasted or, the most common case, completely untouched. The tidying up of the room, which she now always took care of in the evening, could not be done any faster. Streaks of dirt stretched along the walls. Here and there were balls of dust and rubbish. At first, when his sister arrived, Gregor placed himself in such particularly significant corners, in order to reproach her in a certain way by this position. But he might have stayed there for weeks without his sister getting better. She saw the dirt just as he did, but she had just decided to leave it. At the same time, with a sensitivity that was quite new to her, which had taken hold of the whole family, she watched over the fact that the tidying up of Gregor's room was reserved for her. Once his mother had subjected Gregor's room to a great cleaning, which she had only succeeded in doing after using up a few buckets of water. But the amount of moisture also hurt Gregor, and he lay broad, bitter, and immobile on the couch. But the punishment did not fail to come for his mother. For no sooner had his sister noticed the change in Gregor's room in the evening than she ran into the living room, greatly offended, and in spite of her mother's imploringly raised hands, broke into a crying fit, which the parents, the father had of course been startled out of his chair, at first looked on in amazement and helplessness, until they too began to stir. The father on the right reproached the mother for not letting Gregor's room be cleaned by his sister. On the left, on the other hand, the sister shouted that she would never be allowed to clean Gregor's room again, while the mother tried to drag the father, who no longer knew each other because of his excitement, into the bedroom. The sister, shaken by sobs, worked the table with her little fists, and Gregor hissed loudly with rage that it didn't occur to anyone to close the door and spare him this sight and noise. At the same time, with a sensitivity that was quite new to her, which had taken hold of the whole family, she watched over the fact that the tidying up of Gregor's room was reserved for her. Once his mother had subjected Gregor's room to a great cleaning, which she had only succeeded in doing after using up a few buckets of water. But the amount of moisture also hurt Gregor, and he lay broad, bitter and immobile on the couch, but the punishment did not fail to come for his mother. But even if the sister, exhausted by her professional work, had grown tired of caring for Gregor as before, her mother would not have had to stand up for her, and Gregor would not have had to be neglected. Because now the operator was there. This old widow, who may have survived the worst in her long life with the help of her strong bone structure, had no real disgust for Gregor. Without being in any way curious, she had once accidentally opened the door of Gregor's room and had stopped in amazement at the sight of Gregor, who, completely surprised, although no one was chasing him, began to run back and forth, his hands folded in his lap. Since then, she has not neglected to open the door a little in the morning and evening and look into Gregor. At first she called him over too with words she probably thought friendly, such as "Come over, old dung beetle," or "Look at the old dung beetle." Gregor answered nothing to such speeches, but remained motionless in his seat, as if the door had not been opened at all. If only this waitress, instead of letting her disturb him uselessly according to her whim, had been given the order to clean his room every day. One early morning, a heavy rain, perhaps already a sign of the coming spring, Gregor was so embittered when the waitress began to speak again, that he turned against her, as if to attack, but slowly and feebly. The waitress, however, instead of being afraid, merely lifted up a chair near the door, and as she stood there with her mouth wide open, it was clear that she did not intend to close her mouth until the chair in her hand would fall on Gregor's back. "So we can't go any further?" she asked, as Gregor turned around again, and calmly put the chair back in the corner. Gregor now ate almost nothing at all. Only when he happened to pass by the prepared food did he take a bite in his mouth to play, hold it there for hours, and then usually spit it out again. At first he thought it was grief over the condition of his room that kept him from eating, but it was precisely with the changes in the room that he was very soon reconciled. They had become accustomed to put things in this room that could not be accommodated elsewhere, and there were many such things now, since a room in the apartment had been rented to 3 chamberlains. These serious gentlemen, all 3 had full beards, as Gregor once noticed through a crack in the door, were scrupulously concerned about order, not only in their room, but since they had rented a room here in the whole house, especially in the kitchen. They couldn't stand useless or even dirty stuff. Moreover, they had brought most of their own furnishings with them. For this reason, many things had become superfluous, which were not for sale, but which one did not want to throw away either. All of them went into Gregor's room, as well as the ash box and the waste box from the kitchen. What was only useless for the moment, the waitress, who was always in a hurry, simply threw into Gregor's room. Fortunately, Gregor usually only saw the object in question and the hand that held it. The waitress may have intended to fetch the things again at the time and opportunity, or to throw them all out at once, but in fact they would remain where they had come from the first throw, unless Gregor wriggled through the junk and set it in motion, forced at first because there was no other place to crawl, but later with increasing pleasure, although after such wanderings, tired and sad to death, he again did not move for hours. Since the landlords sometimes had their dinner at home in the common living room, the living room door remained closed on some evenings, but Gregor easily refrained from opening the door, as he had not taken advantage of many evenings when it was open, but had lain in the darkest corner of his room without the family noticing. Once, however, the waitress had left the door to the living room a little open, and it remained so open, even when the housekeepers entered in the evening and the light was turned on. They sat down at the table where father, mother, and Gregor had eaten in earlier times, unfolded the napkins, and took knives and forks in their hands. Immediately the mother appeared in the doorway with a bowl of meat, and just behind her the sister with a bowl of potatoes piled up. The food was steaming with heavy smoke. The chamberlains bent over the dishes placed before them, as if to examine them before eating, and in fact the one who sat in the middle, and who seemed to be an authority to the other 2, cut a piece of meat still on the dish, evidently to ascertain whether it was crumbly enough, and whether it should not be sent back to the kitchen. He was satisfied, and his mother and sister, who had been watching intently, began to laugh with a sigh of relief. The family itself ate in the kitchen. Nevertheless, before he went into the kitchen, the father came into this room and made a round of the table with a single bow, cap in hand. The chamberlains all rose and murmured something into their beards. When they were alone, they ate almost in complete silence. It seemed strange to Gregor that one could hear her chewing teeth again and again in all the manifold noises of the meal, as if to show Gregor that one needs teeth to eat, and that even the most beautiful toothless jaws can do nothing. "I have an appetite," Gregor said to himself anxiously, "but not for these things. How these chamberlains feed themselves, and I perish." Just that evening, Gregor did not remember hearing the violin all the time. It sounded from the kitchen. The chamberlains had already finished their supper. The middle one had pulled out a newspaper, given the other two a sheet each, and now they were leaning back and smoking. When the violin began to play, they became attentive, rose, and walked on tiptoe to the anteroom door, where they stood huddled together. They must have been heard from the kitchen, for the father cried, "Is the game perhaps disagreeable to the gentleman? It can be stopped at once." "On the contrary," said the middle of the gentleman, "wouldn't the young lady come in and play here in the room, when it is much more comfortable and comfortable?" "Oh, please," cried the father, as if he were the violinist. The gentleman stepped back into the room and waited. Soon the father came with a music stand, the mother with the music, and the sister with the violin. The sister calmly prepared everything for the game. The parents, who had never let rooms before, and therefore exaggerated their courtesy to the landlords, did not dare to sit down in their own chairs. The father leaned against the door, his right hand stuck between two buttons of the closed livery coat. But the mother was offered a chair by a gentleman, and leaving the chair where the master had accidentally placed it, sat apart in a corner. The sister began to play. Father and mother, each from his side, followed attentively the movements of their hands. Gregor, attracted by the game, had ventured a little further and was already with his head in the living room. He was hardly surprised that he had lately shown so little consideration for the others. Formerly this consideration had been his pride. And yet he would have had more reason to hide himself just now, for in consequence of the dust that lay everywhere in his room, and flew about at the slightest movement, he too was completely covered in dust. He dragged threads, hair, and the remains of food around with him on his back and sides. His indifference to everything was far too great for him to lie down on his back and rub against the carpet, as he had done several times during the day. And in spite of this state of affairs, he was not afraid to advance a little on the immaculate floor of the living room. However, no one paid attention to him either. The family was completely absorbed in violin playing. The chamberlains, on the other hand, who had at first, with their hands in their trouser pockets, positioned themselves much too close behind their sister's music stand, so that they could all have looked at the music, which must have disturbed the sister, soon withdrew to the window with their heads bowed in half-loud conversations, where they remained, watched anxiously by their father. It really seemed as if they were disappointed in their assumption that they were hearing a beautiful or entertaining violin playing, that they were tired of the whole performance, and that they only allowed themselves to be disturbed in their peace out of politeness. Especially the way they all blew the smoke of their cigars out of their noses and mouths suggested great nervousness. And yet the sister played so beautifully. Her face was tilted to one side. Her eyes followed the staves, scrutinizing and sad. Gregor crawled forward a little further and held his head close to the ground so that he might be able to meet her gaze. Was he an animal, since music took hold of him so much? It seemed to him as if the way to the longed-for unknown food was shown to him. He was determined to get as far as his sister, to tug at her skirt, and thereby to indicate to her that she should come into his room with her violin, for no one here rewarded the game as he wished to reward. He would not let her out of his room again, at least not as long as he lived. His frightening figure was to be useful to him for the first time. He wanted to be at all the doors of his room at the same time and hiss at the assailants, but the sister was not to remain with him, but voluntarily. She was to sit beside him on the couch, with her ear bent down to him, and he would then confide to her that he had made it his firm intention to send her to the conservatory, and that, if misfortune had not intervened, he had done so last Christmas. Christmas was already over, wasn't it? Without bothering about any contradictions. After this explanation, the sister would burst into tears of emotion, and Gregor would rise to her armpit and kiss her neck, which she had worn freely without ribbon or collar since she went to the shop. "Mr. Samsa," the middle gentleman called to his father, and without saying another word, pointed with his index finger at Gregor, who was slowly moving forward. The violin fell silent. The middle chamberlain first smiled at his friends, shaking his head, and then looked at Gregor again. The father seemed to think it more necessary, instead of driving Gregor away, to calm down the chamberlains for the time being, although they were not at all excited and Gregor seemed to entertain them more than playing the violin. He hurried to them and tried to push them into their room with outstretched arms and at the same time to block their view of Gregor with his body. They actually became a little angry now. They no longer knew whether about their father's behavior or about the realization that was now dawning on them, without knowing that they had had such a roommate as Gregor. They demanded explanations from their father, raised their arms in their turn, tugged at their beards restlessly, and only slowly retreated towards their room. In the meantime, the sister had overcome the forlornness into which she had fallen after the sudden interruption of playing, and after holding the violin and bow for a while in her casually hanging hands and continuing to look at the music as if she were still playing, she had suddenly pulled herself together, had laid the instrument on her mother's lap, who was still sitting in her chair with her lungs working violently, with breathing difficulties, and had run into the next room, which the chamberlains were approaching more quickly under the insistence of her father. One could see how under the practiced hands of the sister the blankets and cushions in the beds flew up and arranged themselves. Before the gentleman had reached the room, she had finished making her bed and slipped out. The father seemed to be so struck by his obstinacy that he forgot all the respect he owed his tenants. He only pushed and pressed, until already in the door of the room the middle of the gentleman stamped his foot thunderously and thus brought his father to a standstill. "I hereby declare," he said, raising his hand and looking at his mother and sister as well, "that in view of the disgusting conditions prevailing in this apartment and family," here he spat on the floor without hesitation, "I am giving notice of termination of my room at once. Of course, I won't pay the slightest for the days I've lived here, but I'll think about whether I'm not going to make some demands against you, believe me, that are very easy to substantiate." He was silent and looked straight ahead of him as if he were expecting something. In fact, his two friends immediately joined in with the words, "We are also resigning immediately." Then he seized the handle of the door and closed the door with a crash. The father staggered to his chair with groping hands and let himself fall into it. It looked as if he was stretching himself out for his usual evening nap, but the strong nodding of his head, as if uncontrolled, showed that he was not asleep at all. Gregor had been lying quietly the whole time in the place where the chamberlains had caught him. The disappointment at the failure of his plan, but perhaps also the weakness caused by so much starvation, made it impossible for him to move. He feared with a certain certainty a general collapse for the next moment and waited. Not even the violin startled him, which, coming out from under his mother's trembling fingers, fell from her lap and made a resounding sound. "Dear parents," said the sister, slapping her hand on the table as an introduction, "it can't go on like this. If you don't see that, I can see it. I will not pronounce my brother's name before this monster, so I will only say, we must try to get rid of it. We have tried to cultivate and tolerate what is humanly possible, and I don't think anyone can blame us in the least." "She's 1,000 times right," said the father to himself. The mother, who still could not find enough breath, began to cough muffled into the held hand with a mad expression of her eyes. The sister hurried to the mother and held her forehead. The father seemed to have been brought to more definite thoughts by his sister's words, had sat upright, played with his servant's cap between the plates that were still lying on the table from a chamberlain's supper, and sometimes looked at the quiet Gregor. "We must try to get rid of it," said the sister now exclusively to the father, for the mother heard nothing in her coughing. "It will kill you both, I see it coming. If you have to work as hard as we all do, you can't endure this eternal torture at home. I can't do it any more." And she burst into tears so violently that her tears flowed down on her mother's face, from which she wiped them with mechanical movements of her hand. "Child," said the father, pityingly and with remarkable understanding, "but what are we to do?" The sister only shrugged her shoulders as a sign of the perplexity that had now seized her during the weeping, in contrast to her former certainty. "If he only understood us," said the father, half inquiringly. The sister shook her hand violently out of weeping as a sign that it was out of the question. "If he understood us," repeated the father, closing his eyes to his sister's conviction of the impossibility of this, "then perhaps an agreement with him would be possible. But as it is, "It must go," cried the sister. "That is the only remedy, father. You just have to try to get rid of the thought that it is Gregor. The fact that we have believed it for so long is our real misfortune. But how can it be Gregor? If it were Gregor, he would have realized long ago that it is not possible for people to live together with such an animal, and would have left voluntarily. We would then have no brother, but we could continue to live and honor his memory. But as it is, this animal pursues us, drives away the landlords, apparently wants to take over the whole apartment and let us spend the night in the street. Look, father," she cried suddenly, "he's starting again." And in a horror that was completely incomprehensible to Gregor, the sister even left his mother, literally pushed herself off her chair, as if she would rather sacrifice her mother than stay near Gregor, and hurried behind his father, who, merely excited by her behavior, also stood up and raised his arms half in front of her as if to protect his sister. But it did not occur to Gregor to frighten anyone, let alone his sister. He had only begun to turn round to go back to his room, and this was certainly remarkable, since, in consequence of his suffering condition, he had to help with the difficult turns with his head, which he lifted and struck against the floor many times. He paused and looked around. His good intentions seemed to have been recognized. It had been only a momentary terror. Now they all looked at him silently and sadly. The mother lay in her chair, her legs stretched out and pressed together, her eyes almost closed from exhaustion. The father and sister sat side by side. The sister had put her hand around her father's neck. "Now maybe I can turn around," thought Gregor, and began his work again. He could not suppress the panting of the exertion and had to rest here and there. For the rest, no one urged him, everything was left to him. When he had completed the turn, he immediately began to walk straight back. He was amazed at the great distance that separated him from his room, and did not understand how, in his weakness a short time before, he had taken the same way, almost without noticing it. Always anxious only to crawl quickly, he hardly paid attention to the fact that no word, no exclamation from his family disturbed him. Only when he was already in the door did he turn his head, not completely, because he felt his neck stiffen. At least he could still see that nothing had changed behind him, only the sister had stood up. His last glance touched his mother, who was now completely asleep. As soon as he was inside his room, the door was hastily bolted and locked. Gregor was so frightened by the sudden noise behind him that his little legs buckled. It was the sister who had hurried so much. She had already stood there upright and waited, then she had jumped forward light-footedly. Gregor hadn't heard her coming, and finally, she called to her parents as she turned the key in the lock. "And now?" asked Gregor, looking around in the dark. He soon discovered that he could no longer move at all. He was not surprised at this. Rather, it seemed unnatural to him that he had actually been able to move around with these thin little legs until now. For the rest, he felt comparatively comfortable. He had pains all over his body, but he felt as if they were gradually getting weaker and weaker and finally disappearing altogether. He hardly felt the rotten apple in his back and the inflamed surroundings, which were completely covered in soft dust. He thought back to his family with emotion and love. His opinion that he must disappear was perhaps even more decisive than that of his sister. In this state of empty and peaceful reflection, he remained until the tower clock struck the 3rd hour of the morning. He lived to see the beginning of the general brightening outside the window. Then his head sank down completely without his will, and his last breath streamed faintly from his nostrils. When the waitress came early in the morning, out of sheer strength and haste, no matter how often she had been asked to avoid it, she slammed all the doors shut in such a way that it was no longer possible to sleep peacefully in the whole apartment from the moment she came. She found nothing special at first during her usual short visit to Gregor. She thought he was lying there so motionless on purpose, playing the offended man. She trusted him with all possible sense. Because she happened to be holding the long broom in her hand, she tried to tickle Gregor from the door with it. When there was no success either, she became angry and pushed Gregor a little, and only when she had pushed him out of his place without any resistance did she pay attention. When she soon realized the true state of affairs, she opened her eyes wide, whistled to herself, but did not stay long, but flung open the door of the bedroom and cried out in a loud voice into the darkness, "Just look at it, it has died. There it lies, utterly dead." Mr. and Mrs. Samsa sat upright in the marriage bed and had to get over the horror of the waitress before they came to understand her report. But then Mr. and Mrs. Samsa, each on his side, got out of bed in a hurry. Mr. Samsa threw the blanket over his shoulders. Mrs. Samsa came out only in her nightgown, so they entered Gregor's room. In the meantime, the door of the sitting room, in which Greta had slept since the Chamberlains had moved in, had also opened. She was fully dressed, as if she had not slept at all, and her pale face seemed to prove it. "Dead," said Mrs. Samsa, looking up at the waitress questioningly, although she could check everything herself and even recognize it without checking. "That's what I mean," said the waitress, pushing Gregor's body a long way sideways with the broom to prove it. Mrs. Samsa made a movement as if she wanted to hold back the broom, but did not. "Well," said Mr. Samsa, "now we can thank God." He crossed himself, and the three women followed his example. Greta, who did not take her eyes off the corpse, said, "Just look how thin he was. He hasn't eaten for such a long time." As soon as the food came in, they came out again. In fact, Gregor's body was completely flat and dry. You could only see that now that he was no longer lifted from his legs and nothing else distracted the view. "Come in, Greta, to us for a while," said Mrs. Samsa with a wistful smile, and Greta, not without looking back at the corpse, went into the bedroom behind her parents. The waitress closed the door and opened the window completely. Despite the early morning, the fresh air was already mixed with a bit of lukewarmness. It was already the end of March. The three Chamberlains came out of their room and looked around in amazement for their breakfast. They had been forgotten. "Where's the breakfast?" asked the middle of the gentlemen sullenly of the waitresses. But she put her finger to her mouth and then hastily and silently beckoned to the gentlemen to come to Gregor's room. They also came and then stood, their hands in the pockets of their somewhat worn skirts, in the now quite bright room around Gregor's corpse. Then the door of the bedroom opened, and Mr. Samsa appeared in his livery, with his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other. Everyone was a little weeping. Greta sometimes pressed her face to her father's arm. "Leave my apartment at once," said Mr. Samsa, pointing to the door without letting the women go. "What do you mean?" said the middle of the gentlemen, somewhat dismayed, and smiled sweetly. The other two held their hands behind their backs, and rubbed them together incessantly, as if in joyful expectation of a great quarrel, which, however, must have been favorable to them. "I mean it exactly as I say it," answered Mr. Samsa, walking in line with his two companions towards the landlord. At first he stood still and looked at the floor, as if things were coming together in his head to form a new order. "Then let's go," he said, and looked up at Mr. Samsa, as if in a sudden humility he was demanding a new permit even for this decision. Mr. Samsa just nodded to him several times briefly with wide eyes. Thereupon the gentleman actually went immediately with long strides into the anteroom. His two friends had been listening for a while with very steady hands and were now almost hopping after him, as if in fear that Mr. Samsa might enter the anteroom before them and disturb the connection with their guide. In the anteroom, all three took their hats from the clothes hanger, pulled their sticks out of the cane container, bowed silently, and left the apartment. In a completely unfounded mistrust, as it turned out, Mr. Samsa stepped out into the forecourt with the two women. Leaning against the railing, they watched as the three gentlemen descended the long staircase slowly, but steadily, disappeared at a certain bend in the staircase on each floor, and came out again after a few moments. The deeper they got, the more the Samsa family's interest in them was lost, and when, towards them and then high above them, a butcher's apprentice with a stretcher on his head climbed up in a proud posture, Mr. Samsa soon left the railing with the women, and all returned to their apartment, as if relieved. They decided to use the day to rest and walk. They not only deserved this break from work, they even needed it desperately. And so they sat down at the table and wrote 3 letters of apology, Mr. Samsa to his management, Mrs. Samsa to her employer, and Greta to her principal. While she was writing, the waitress came in to say that she was going away, for her morning's work was finished. At first the 3 writers merely nodded without looking up. Only when the waitress still did not want to leave did they look up angrily. "Well?" asked Mr. Samsa. The waitress stood in the doorway, smiling, as if she had a great fortune to report to the family, but would only do so if she was thoroughly questioned. The almost erect little ostrich feather on her hat, which had annoyed Mr. Samsa during her entire period of service, swayed slightly in all directions. "So what do you want?" asked Mrs. Samsa, for whom the waitress still had the most respect. "Yes," replied the waitress, unable to go on with a friendly laugh. "So you don't have to worry about how the stuff is going to be removed from next door. It's all right." Mrs. Samsa and Greta bent down to their letters as if they wanted to continue writing. Mr. Samsa, who noticed that the waitress now wanted to begin to describe everything in detail, resolutely repelled this with an outstretched hand. But as she was not allowed to tell, she remembered the great hurry she had, cried out in an obviously offended manner, "Goodbye everyone," turned wildly and left the apartment with a terrible slamming of the door. "She'll be dismissed in the evening," said Mr. Samsa, but he didn't get an answer from his wife or his daughter, because the waitress seemed to have disturbed her barely gained peace again. They got up, went to the window, and stayed there, holding each other in their arms. Mr. Samsa turned to them in his chair and watched them quietly for a while. Then he cried, "Then come here. Leave the old things at last. And be a little considerate of me, too." Immediately the women followed him, hurried to him, caressed him, and quickly finished their letters. Then all three left the apartment together, which they hadn't done for months, and took the electric train outside the city. The carriage in which they sat alone was all shining through with warm sun. Leaning back comfortably in their seats, they discussed the prospects for the future, and it turned out that on closer inspection they were not bad at all, for all three jobs, about which they had not yet asked each other, were extremely favorable and especially promising for later on. The greatest immediate improvement of the situation must of course easily result from a change of residence. They now wanted to take a smaller and cheaper, but better located and generally more practical apartment than the present one, which Gregor had chosen. While they were thus talking, Mr. and Mrs. Samsa, at the sight of their daughter, who was becoming more and more lively, remembered almost at the same time how she had blossomed into a beautiful and voluptuous girl of late, in spite of all the trouble that had made her cheeks pale. Becoming quieter and almost unconsciously communicating by looks, they thought that it would now be time to look for a good man for them. And it was like a confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions when, at the end of their journey, the daughter was the first to rise and stretch her young body.